So I have a guess as to why you're all either here this morning or tuning in this morning for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. I don't think it's about the shofar or Musaf or hearing more from Alex or myself. I think it's because after my introduction to yesterday's Torah reading, you needed to hear how the story ended. You needed to hear the rest of the story of the Akedah, the binding and near sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham. You've all come for the white-knuckle drama of biblical narrative at its most harrowing and disturbing, the dramatic conclusion to the Abraham saga. After finally seeing Abraham and Sarah's dreams fulfilled through the miraculous birth of Isaac, we watch with bated breath as father and son heed God's word and journey into the wilderness to offer the ultimate sacrifice. It is in many ways a paradigmatic high holiday story. Like Abraham and Sarah, we have so much to be grateful for in our lives. So many wonderful things that bring us joy on a daily basis. So many dreams we wish to see fulfilled for those we love. On the high holidays, we recognize how fragile that existence is, how much we stand to lose on the precipice of judgment before God. And we hope that as Isaac was saved by divine intervention and blessed at the last possible moment, we too can receive the blessings of safety, health, happiness, and prosperity at the end of Yom Kippur. We hope to experience the same sigh of relief as Abraham and his family when the divine voice finally instructed him to put down the knife. The Torah puts these near tragic events in the rearview mirror by quickly telling us of the extended family born to Abraham, culminating in the birth of Rebekah, Isaac's future beloved. Our story has a happy fairy tale ending. No harm, no foul. Let's never speak of this again. The Torah, as we know, however, wears many different literary hats, but fairy tale is not one of them. There are two very famous midrashim, rabbinic expositions, that tell us how devastating the long-term consequences of the Akedah truly are. We learn later in the book of Genesis, when Isaac is facing his own dramatic turn with two sons fighting for succession, that in the words of the Torah, his eyes are dim, a poetic way of saying he is nearly blind. Now, we can chalk that up to old age, perhaps cataracts, but the rabbis aren't content with that explanation. Rosh, the great medieval French commentator, explains that when Isaac was bound upon the altar and his father was about to slay him, at that very moment, the heavens opened, the ministering angels saw it and wept, and their tears flowed and fell upon Isaac's eyes, which thus became dim. In the rabbinic imagination, Isaac never actually escapes the trauma of his near murder at the hands of his father and God. Isaac is permanently scarred. And Isaac is not the only one who the rabbis imagine suffering as a result of this episode. The very next chapter begins with the recounting of Sarah's death at the age of 127. The rabbis, reading these stories back to back, figure there must be a connection, and so they tell a story of their own. The Midrash relates that God's adversary, the rabbinic euphemism for Satan, was frustrated that Abraham did not actually kill Isaac. What did Satan do? He went and said to Sarah, "Haven't you heard what has happened in the world?" She said to him, "No." He said to her, Your husband Abraham has taken your son Isaac and slain him and offered him up as a burnt offering upon the altar." She began to weep and cried aloud 3 times, corresponding to 3 long tekiah notes of the shofar, and she gave forth 3 more howlings corresponding to the 3 disconnected short notes of the shofar, and her soul fled, and she died. Isaac carries the scars with him for the rest of his life, as he can literally only view the world through eyes that were changed by the events of that fateful day. His mother never recovers. For her, a close call was too close, and she suffers the consequences. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, a poetic modern biblical scholar, expounds on an unusual Hebrew word that the commentary uses to describe the shock that led to Sarah's death, the word nivhal. She writes that what Sarah experienced is something like dizziness, even a kind of nausea. It's vertigo. It's not knowing where one is, a shock in the sense of loss of orientation. I don't know at all where I am in the world. It's a very common reaction to a situation in which one is almost naval, almost. If it's really just a matter of a millimeter, it could go this way, it could go that way. How do we understand God's providence? How do we understand anything in view of such events? I imagine we have all asked ourselves some versions of these questions over the last 2 years. Never before has going to the grocery store, coming to shul, hugging a friend or a loved one been so weighed down by feelings of not knowing, of feeling like we are only a millimeter away from calamity. Experiences that were once so familiar have become utterly disorienting. And what we need to recognize is that even if we were all crammed into the sanctuary, even if we weren't wearing masks, we would still be bound. Just as Isaac could never recover from the angel's tears in his eyes, we can't hope to uncry the tears we've shed since March of 2020 or pretend that we're not wounded. There is no timeline to becoming whole, no magic word that we can invoke and pretend that none of this ever happened. Which does not mean that we are powerless in our circumstances. The story of the binding of Isaac, while encompassing humanity in so many ways, is conspicuously absent of compassion. The word compassion comes from a Latin root, meaning to suffer with. It's a sensitivity to the suffering of another and a desire to alleviate that suffering. Compassion is not a trait that we have or lack. It's something that we can choose to practice. And the practice is achievable for all of us. Treating ourselves and others as we wish to be treated, prioritizing our common humanity, and building connection to others through kindness and acceptance. Imagine if God, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac had kept compassion on the forefront of their behavior and communication. They could have recognized each other's suffering in real time, and perhaps they could have worked together to alleviate it rather than exacerbate it all around. Abraham could have clued Sarah in on what was going on. Isaac could have expressed to his father the fear that he felt. God could have recognized that tests that push people past their breaking points are perhaps not something that God built humanity to sustain. The Orchot Tzadikim, a 15th century German book of Jewish ethics, teaches us that just as one would want compassion in their time of need, so should one have compassion on others who are in need. The world is experiencing a prolonged moment where each and every one of us is in a time of need. Unfortunately, that need and the unseen suffering that is accompanying it isn't going away. Yet, unlike Isaac, bound on the altar alone, unlike Sarah, shocked out of life without family by her side, unlike Abraham, stoically continuing on, we have the power to show each other compassion, and we can bind ourselves to each other in the year ahead with support and love and compassion. Shana Tova.